By early 1945, Hitler's Third Reich was nearing its final collapse. In the west, Allied forces had advanced to within striking distance of the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army was pushing across the Polish border into Germany. As the Allies fought their way toward Berlin from both east and west, German troops resisted every step. But the battle was already beyond saving. By May 1945, Hitler would be dead, and Germany would finally surrender. February 1945 arrived, and the Allied forces in the west had gathered near the Rhine for the final drive into Germany. In the north stood the massive ranks of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. To the south was General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. It included the U.S. Third Army, led by General George Patton. On February 8th, Montgomery's Army Group launched a two-pronged attack against German forces defending the Rhine. The northern prong battled through dense woodland terrain. The southern prong was held back after the Germans released water from several dams, flooding the nearby region. It took more than 2 weeks before both prongs finally joined together on the west bank of the Rhine. By early March 1945, Montgomery's forces controlled nearly 60 miles of the river's west bank. Their next objective was crossing it. South of Montgomery, Bradley's armies were also advancing east, searching for a way across the river. On March 7, 1945, they reached the Rhine at Cologne, but Hitler had ordered every bridge destroyed. Then, while American troops searched farther south, they discovered one bridge still standing near the small town of Remagen. They rushed toward it, sweeping aside German resistance. Then, just as they prepared to cross, an explosion erupted, but against all odds, the bridge stayed standing. A small group of Americans sprinted across, desperately cutting every wire that looked like a demolition cable. U.S. commanders quickly sent more troops across as fast as they could. The Allies had finally broken into the German heartland in Berlin. The news that the bridge at Remagen had been captured enraged Hitler. 5 junior officers faced court-martial. 4 were executed. At the same time, the exhausted German commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was dismissed. It was the second time he had been removed in less than a year. He was replaced by the experienced Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had previously commanded operations in North Africa and Italy. During the following week, the Germans launched desperate air attacks hoping to destroy the bridge at Remagen. None succeeded. Then, unexpectedly, on March 17th, while combat engineers repaired it, the bridge suddenly collapsed. 28 men fell to their deaths. The first Allied advance into Germany had been halted. Meanwhile, farther north, Montgomery was preparing the first full-scale Allied crossing of the Rhine. On March 23, 1945, he launched a massive aerial bombardment against German forces defending the river's east bank. Around 200 RAF Lancaster bombers almost completely destroyed the town of Wesel. Then British commandos crossed in Buffalo amphibious vehicles. They faced very little resistance from the stunned German defenders. More divisions followed behind them. The crossing continued throughout the entire night. The next day, in the largest airborne operation of the war, 17,000 soldiers from the British 6th and U.S. 17th Airborne Divisions were dropped to capture key positions east of the river. They encountered intense German anti-aircraft fire. A newsreel report described the battle. Within a short time, hundreds of gliders made their dangerous landings, and their troops entered the fight the moment they touched down. One glider lost a wing only 50 feet above the ground. More than half the gliders were destroyed or damaged before landing, but within hours the paratroopers linked up with Montgomery's ground forces, and the Allied bridgehead was firmly secured. It should have been a glorious moment for the fiercely competitive Montgomery, but the spotlight was stolen. The night before, his greatest rival, General Patton, had unexpectedly crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim and was already inside Germany. It reflected the fierce rivalry between Montgomery and the American commanders, as both sides raced to be the first into Germany. Over the following days, More Allied forces crossed the river. German defenses along the Rhine quickly collapsed. In the north, Montgomery advanced deeper into Germany toward Münster. In the south, Bradley's forces, including Patton's Third Army, pushed east toward Marburg and Limburg. The major German city of Frankfurt am Main was surrounded and bypassed. Fanatical German troops continued fighting fiercely, but by then there was no doubt Germany was beaten. The only question was when they would finally accept it. While the Western Allies fought their way across Western Germany, Stalin's Red Army in Poland prepared to launch a massive offensive against Germany's eastern border. Hitler's forces in the region were poorly armed and completely unprepared to stop the attack. Weapon supplies had become so scarce that many soldiers were forced to use First World War rifles. German intelligence estimated the Red Army's infantry outnumbered them by 11-1. The Soviets also possessed overwhelming numbers of tanks and artillery, while the Germans had almost nothing left. Hitler's strategic reserve had already been exhausted on the Western Front. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet offensive began with its familiar massive artillery bombardment. It stretched across a 300-mile front. 1 week later, the Red Army entered the shattered ruins of Warsaw. From there, they continued pushing west toward the German border, nearly 300 miles away. Farther south, another Soviet force captured the Polish city of Krok-Wałęsa on January 18th. As Soviet armies surged westward across Poland on a broad front, they left isolated pockets of German resistance in cities such as Poznań and Breslau. Those strongholds would be cleared out later. By the end of January 1945, Soviet troops had crossed into Germany and reached the River Oder. The Russians now stood only an hour's drive east of Berlin. For the experienced Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov, it was an extraordinary victory. His forces had covered 300 miles in only 14 days. It became one of the fastest and longest blitzkrieg-style advances in military history. Zhukov's troops paused to recover and wait for supplies. Soon another group of Soviet armies joined them, digging defensive positions farther south along the River Neisse. At the same time, a third Soviet force trapped the remaining German armies in East Prussia, inside the Baltic port of Nyksburg, now known as Kaliningrad. Hitler appointed SS chief Heinrich Himmler to command German forces in the neighboring region. It showed just how deeply he had lost trust in his own army generals, but Himmler had neither military training nor battlefield experience. Throughout February 1945, the troops under Himmler's command were crushed by Soviet forces advancing westward. This time, Hitler still had the chance to send reinforcements. A large German force remained stationed on the Courland Peninsula in neighboring Latvia, but in yet another baffling decision, Hitler refused to let them break out and help. He remained obsessed with holding on to territory, his Lebensraum, no matter how pointless or costly it had become. As a result, nearly 200,000 German soldiers spent the final months of the war doing absolutely nothing. The Red Army now prepared for its final assault on Berlin. The German capital was less than 50 miles away. Across Germany, the approaching Soviet invasion triggered widespread panic among civilians. Soviet soldiers had witnessed the horrific destruction caused by the Germans throughout the Soviet Union. They had seen entire towns and villages destroyed and countless civilians massacred. Now, they were clearly seeking revenge. Terrifying stories spread of Soviet rape, murder, and looting. Through deep snow and freezing temperatures, more than 5 million German civilians fled westward from the Eastern Front, searching for safety. Another 2 million people were evacuated by sea from German-controlled ports along the Baltic coast. They became easy targets for Soviet submarines. 24 German passenger ships were torpedoed. Among them was the cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying more than 10,000 people. Fewer than 1,000 survived, making it the deadliest single maritime disaster in history. Hitler's acting chief of staff, General Heinz Guderian, urged the Führer to recall every available unit from the Western Front to defend Berlin. Hitler agreed to bring back the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, but instead of sending it to Berlin, he dispatched it to Hungary. He had become obsessed with protecting Germany's last major oil supply, the Hungarian oil fields west of Lake Balaton. It proved to be a disastrous decision. In Hungary, the panzers were hopelessly outnumbered by Soviet forces. To make matters even worse, the weather turned against them. A sudden thaw transformed the ground into a vast sea of mud. For several days, the panzers struggled to slow the Soviet advance, but they were steadily pushed back into Austria. Soon they were drawn into the defense of Vienna as the Red Army closed in on the Austrian capital. By then, the 6th SS Panzer Army was completely exhausted. Its commander, SS General Sepp Dietrich, understood the reality. "We call ourselves the 6th Panzer Army," he said, "because we have only 6 panzers left." On April 10th, the Red Army swept them aside and captured Vienna. As that happened, the biggest question became, who would reach Berlin first? Would it be the Red Army or the Western Allies? The race for Berlin had become not only a military contest, but also a political one. By March 1945, the Red Army stood ready along the River Oder, preparing for the final assault on Berlin. This created a difficult decision for the Allied command in the West. Berlin was less than 300 miles from their front lines. Most Allied commanders wanted to race toward the city before the Soviets arrived. However, 1 month earlier, at the Yalta Conference on the Black Sea coast, the Allied leaders had already divided Germany into occupation zones. Berlin was firmly assigned to the Soviet zone. Because of that, Eisenhower ordered his commanders to ignore Berlin and instead spread out to capture the rest of Germany. On April 1st, American troops surrounded the German industrial region of the Ruhr. German soldiers defending the area fought stubbornly. When the region finally fell 2 weeks later, more than 325,000 German troops were captured. It was one of the largest mass surrenders of German soldiers during the entire war. The German commander, the fanatical Nazi Field Marshal Walter Model, took his own life. In other parts of Germany, resistance became increasingly scattered, and General Bradley's army swept rapidly across the country. By April 18, 1945, American forces had broken through to the Czech border, effectively splitting Germany into two. Meanwhile, north of the Ruhr, Montgomery's Canadian First Army began the liberation of the Netherlands. The Dutch people had suffered terribly during the brutal winter of 1944-1945. The German occupation forces had deliberately seized food and fuel supplies to support other fronts. As a result, countless civilians died from hunger and freezing conditions. The Dutch town of Arnhem was captured on April 15, 1945. The advance continued quickly, and the very next day the Canadians liberated Groningen near the Dutch northern coast. That left a large German army almost untouched, but completely surrounded near Amsterdam. Soon afterward, a ceasefire was arranged. Allied aircraft then thundered across the Dutch countryside, dropping food and medical supplies. At the same time, the British Second Army, also under Montgomery's command, advanced rapidly across the North German plain. Osnabrück fell on April 4th. Soon the British reached the German port of Bremen. There they faced fierce German resistance. It took 9 days of brutal house-to-house fighting before the port was finally secured. 2 days later, Montgomery's British forces reached the Elbe River at Lauenburg. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, they uncovered horrifying new evidence of the Nazis' final solution. In early April 1945, American troops captured the concentration camp at Ohrdruf near Weimar in central Germany. A deeply shaken General Eisenhower personally visited the camp. Most prisoners had already been evacuated by the SS, but behind them they left piles of dead bodies. 8 days later, British troops entered another concentration camp at Belsen, north of Hanover. There, they found more than 70,000 prisoners. Thousands had already died. The survivors were starving, sick, and suffering from disease. A BBC radio report by correspondent Richard Dimbleby described the horrific scene. I passed through the barrier and found myself in the world of a nightmare. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. It was as though they were waiting their turn. This is what the Germans did. Let there be no mistake about it. They did it deliberately and slowly. Meanwhile, far to the south in Italy, the German front was also beginning to collapse. German forces were firmly dug into defensive positions across the Apennine Mountains. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, launched a major spring offensive. On April 9, 1945, British troops attacked, drawing German forces away from other parts of the front. 5 days later, American troops also advanced and quickly reached the southern bank of the River Po. The Germans withdrew to the northern bank, but Hitler's commander in Italy, General Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, knew he could not stop the Allied advance much longer. He secretly approached the Allies, and on April 29th, he agreed to an unconditional surrender. It officially took effect on May 2, 1945. This became the first formal surrender of German forces anywhere in Europe. The war was now racing toward its final chapter. Back in Germany, American and Soviet forces had finally linked up along the Elbe River near Leipzig. The moment the world has been awaiting so long, when alley from west meets alley from east. The historic meeting took place on April 26, when soldiers from the American 69th Infantry Division, led by Major General Reinhardt, crossed the Elbe by boat to meet Soviet troops waiting on the opposite bank. The stage was now set for the final assault on Berlin. Hitler was growing increasingly desperate. He now called upon both the elderly and young boys to help defend the German capital. His so-called Thousand-Year Reich was preparing for one last catastrophic battle to survive. On April 1, 1945, Joseph Stalin summoned his top commanders to Moscow and gave them their orders for the capture of Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most successful commander, would launch the main attack from his bridgehead along the Oder River. A second group of Soviet armies, led by Marshal Ivan Konev, would cross the River Nisei farther south and drive deep into Germany, bypassing Berlin itself. Together, they commanded an overwhelming force of more than 2.5 million soldiers. They were supported by 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, along with 40,000 artillery pieces, mortars, and rocket launchers, but the Germans were determined not to surrender without a fight. Berlin was defended by around 1 million troops. Many were positioned inside heavily fortified defenses, especially along the Silo Heights, a steep ridge rising above the Oder Valley, directly in front of Zhukov's planned attack. The defenders were a mixed force of experienced combat veterans, fanatical SS troops, inexperienced teenage conscripts as young as 14, and elderly members of the Volkssturm, also known as the People's Army. By then, Hitler had withdrawn into a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He had become a frail, heavily medicated man who spent much of his time giving increasingly unrealistic orders to armies that mostly no longer existed. His public appearances had become extremely rare, but in early March he was persuaded to visit troops preparing to defend the Oder Line. Later that same month, he appeared once more to inspect a small group of Hitler Youth soldiers. It would be the last time he was ever seen by news cameras. Then, on April 12, 1945, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt died from a heart attack. He had been one of the key architects of the Allied war effort, leading America's full commitment to the fight. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels quickly used the news to convince his increasingly delusional frere that the Allied alliance would fall apart. He claimed Germany could still snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But those hopes were soon shattered. 3 days after Roosevelt's death, Zhukov launched his assault on Berlin. He had positioned one artillery gun for every 13 feet along the front line. However, The German defenders had predicted the attack and pulled back before the bombardment began. As a result, when Zhukov's infantry moved forward, they ran into unexpectedly fierce resistance. Desperate to regain momentum, Zhukov sent in his tanks, but they also became trapped and slowed down. Meanwhile, farther south, Konev's second group of Soviet armies achieved far greater success. His troops crossed the Neisse River and quickly advanced toward their next obstacle, the River Spree. Stalin fueled the rivalry between his two commanders by giving Konev permission to turn his tanks north toward Berlin. He welcomed the competition to see who would capture the city first. After 3 days of brutal fighting, Zhukov's forces finally reached the eastern suburbs of Berlin. At the same time, Konev's armies were closing in from the south. German resistance remained fierce, but on April 25th, the two Soviet armies linked up, and the final assault on Berlin officially began. As the battle spread from one district to another, civilians slowly emerged from their underground shelters. But the Soviet troops paid little attention to white flags of surrender. The rape of German women and girls became widespread. After another 3 days of fierce fighting, the remaining German defenders were trapped inside a narrow section of central Berlin, less than 2 miles wide. Every street, every building, and every house became a battlefield. Then, on the morning of April 30th, Soviet troops launched a major assault on the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building. Stalin considered it the ultimate symbol of Nazi power. The attackers were pinned down by heavy German fire, so they blasted the building at close range with powerful artillery. That evening, Soviet soldiers stormed inside. Intense fighting erupted from room to room through hallways, staircases, and corridors. 4 hours later, the red flag was finally raised above one of the Reichstag's towers. The following morning, on May 1, 1945, the moment was recreated for the cameras. But by then, Hitler was already dead. On April 30th, while fierce fighting continued above his bunker, the man whose ruthless ambitions had dragged the world into war, devastated an entire continent, and led to the murder of millions of Jews, took his own life. His longtime companion Eva Braun, whom he had married just 1 day earlier, died beside him. Their partially burned bodies were buried in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, while the battle outside continued. Before his death, Hitler had appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. For the next few days, Germany's new leadership tried desperately to save something from the nation's catastrophic defeat. On May 1, 1945, 1 day after Hitler's death, the German people were told that their Führer had died fighting in battle. They were also urged to continue resisting what they called the Bolshevik threat. But the German government was rapidly falling apart. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann attempted to negotiate a citywide ceasefire with the Soviets. Marshal Zhukov refused, demanding the unconditional surrender of every German force everywhere. It was a demand Goebbels and Bormann could never meet. Fighting inside Berlin continued. Later that evening, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. That same night, Bormann disappeared. Decades later, in the 1990s, Na testing confirmed that a body discovered in Berlin was his. The following morning, Berlin officially surrendered. By mid-afternoon, all fighting inside the city had finally ended.